And I'd like to introduce our final keynote address, our final keynote speaker, Dean Baker. Dean Baker co-founded the Center for Economic and Policy Research in 1999. He has also worked as a consultant for the World Bank, the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress. His analyses have appeared in many publications, including the Atlantic Monthly, the Washington Post, the London Financial Times, and the New York Daily News. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. He's authored a couple of books, Getting Back to Full Employment, A Better Bargain for Working People. Others include The End of Loser Liberalism, Making Markets Progressive, Taking Economics Seriously, and then lastly, his book, The Conservative Nanny State. And I want to read a paragraph out of The Conservative Nanny State, and I might add that you can download this book for free off the website from the Center for Economic and Policy Research. He says, political debates in the United States are routinely framed as a battle between conservatives who may favor market outcomes, whatever they may be, against liberals who prefer government intervention to ensure that families have decent standards of living. This description of the two poles is inaccurate. Both conservatives and liberals want government intervention. The difference between them is the goal of government intervention, and the fact that conservatives are smart enough to conceal their dependence on the government. It's a very good read. I should also say that Dean writes a blog that is excellent. He makes fun of the Washington Post and their economic reasoning almost on a daily basis, or their lack of it, I should say. And it's well worth it. They have a currency, kind of a federal budget calculator on their website that is fascinating. So, for example, if you read in the newspapers about a program costing $2 or $3 billion, you can plug that into their calculator and it will show you just what percentage that is of the federal budget. And when you're talking about $2 or $3 billion, it might be 0.00001% of what the budget actually is. It's just wonderful stuff. And so those numbers sound really large in the newspapers, but in actuality, they're not. So that's enough for me. Without any further ado, Dean Baker.
Thanks, John. I appreciate the introduction. I appreciate less having to go after the theater group, but whatever. I'll try not to be too boring for folks. You mentioned my book. I had someone review it, and they said, Baker's book is available for free. It's worth it. Okay, hopefully you won't think that, but well, you'll think that it's worth at least that. All right, well, I really appreciate the chance to talk to you, and actually I will be picking up from that because, much of my work is devoted to this idea of trying to show how policy has led to inequality. So again, there's this big debate. I'm glad to see the debate, but much of its focus, most of you probably heard of Thomas Piketty's book, Capital for the 21st Century. We've had this big growth in inequality. Can't really argue with it. Some people still try to, but I think it's pretty hard to seriously argue with it. So then the question is, why did that happen? What can we do about it? And a lot of the discussion starts from the premise that, well, this just happened. It was, it's bad maybe, but it happened, and then we feel bad about it, so maybe there's some things we could do. And I think it's really important to argue it didn't just happen, we did it. I don't mean the people in the room here did it, but it was government policy that did it. And I think that's really important to understand when we look at inequality because, it means we should feel more need to do something that, it's not something that, it's raining outside, what can we do about it? No, it was government policy. Secondly, if we want to think of how to undo it, it's really important to know where that came from. Okay, so that's what I'm going to try and outline here today. Okay, I list 6 main causes. Bloated financial sector, if we look at where are the richest people in the country, many of them, I won't say all of them, many of them you find on Wall Street. Okay, a lot of huge fortunes made there in the last 10, 15, 20 years. You always have rich people on Wall Street. The difference is you have more of them and they're richer. Second, trade. And I'll be very clear here. People talk about trade and, it's often talked about globalization. It's this, force that came down. What can we do? You don't want to try and hold back the ocean. The point I make about trade is we directed the ocean. Okay, we we directed, and this is very visible, I'll talk a little bit about this Trans-Pacific Partnership. We design trade deals, a main focus of our trade deals has been to put our manufacturing workers in direct competition with low-paid workers in the developing world. The theory, people say, oh, it didn't work according to plan. No, the theory of that is that will put downward pressure on the wages of manufacturing workers. And in fact, large segments of the workforce, because when you lose your job in manufacturing, you go work in retail, you go work in the service sector, you put downward pressure on the wages of large segments of the workforce. That's by design. Okay, we could have structured trade differently, and I'll get to that. Third point, a failed corporate governance process, corporate governance process, I could say that. We've seen an explosion of CEO pay. I'll argue that's due to the fact that there's no effective check on CEO pay. So the CEO is just saying, give me more money, and there's no one at the other side to say no. So it's not a market transaction, it's the CEO dealing with their friends. Patent and copyright abuses, patents and copyrights, as much as I have free market friends, or people think of themselves as free market friends, they think God gave us patents, and it's not true. I looked through the Bible, couldn't find it. The government creates patents. These are government-granted monopolies. I understand the rationale. You want to give someone incentive. That's a way to do that. The question is that the best way to do it? Union management policy, it's not a secret. We've seen a plunge in unionization rates in the United States over the last 3 decades. I'd say much of that is policy. It's not all policy, but a lot of that was conscious policy. It was conscious policy to weaken the power of unions in the United States. The last point, unemployment of the Federal Reserve Board. This has been in the news, it will be in the news. Unemployment, the Federal Reserve Board plays a very direct role in affecting the unemployment rate. When they raise interest rates, they slow the economy, keep people from getting jobs, raise the unemployment rate. And I'll point out, it doesn't just affect unemployment, that affects wages, affects the distribution of income. Okay, first point, the financial sector. We've had this massive explosion in finance. It's quintupled as a share of the GDP since the 1970s. I'm not using funny numbers here. I try to put things in context. So taking it as a share of GDP, if you go back to the 70s, and here, by the way, I should point out, I'm speaking of finance very narrowly. I'm thinking of the people who shuffle money back and forth. Commodities and futures trading, investment banking. Think about Goldman Sachs. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, so I'm not talking about, you get life insurance. That's increased too, but I'm talking about very narrowly, shuffling, stocks and bonds and derivatives, shuffling those back and forth. That's quintupled since the 70s as a share of GDP. And I would argue, the rationale, if we had our friends from Goldman Sachs here, they go, sure, well, we do all this great stuff. We allocate capital. So, we have, I'm saving for my retirement. People, 401ks, if you're lucky enough to have a job in 401k, you have a little something in retirement, you need someone to invest in, right? And that's going to be allocated to, firms that need it to grow, to expand. Okay, well, we had that in the 70s too, and it cost us much less money. Okay, so I'd argue you're very hard-pressed to try and make a story that somehow the financial sector is better serving us today than it was 40 years ago, when it was much cheaper relative to the size of the economy. Point here is, if I had our friend from Goldman Sachs here, he or she has to tell me, oh, we do that much better today than was the case back in the 70s. So you go, okay, so is the economy growing more rapidly? Do we have more rapid productivity growth? That's clearly not true. They might say that, but that's not true. Am I more secure in my savings? A little hard. Anyone who's lived through the crash in 2000, 2002 of the stock market, and then the more recent housing bubble and the crash. A little hard to say that. I don't think anyone can feel more secure in their savings in the stock market than was true, 40 or 50 years ago. So if you just say, okay, what do you people do? Is there any reason I think you're doing it better? You're charging us a lot more money. Is there any reason I think you're doing it better today than was the case, 40 years ago? And I think the answer to that is no. Essentially, what we've had is we've had an explosion of this sector. It's been associated with improvements in technology. You have a lot of the derivative instruments that you have today. You couldn't have done those 40 years ago. It's doing the technology to support it. And you have to price a complex derivative. If you're doing that with a hand calculator, you couldn't possibly do that. You need modern computing power. So we have these complex derivative instruments. We have the ability to trade, shares of stock, millions of shares of stock in a tiny fraction of a second. We've seen this huge explosion in computing power that's led to an enormous expansion of the sector, and basically it's an enormous amount of rent. It hasn't allowed us to better allocate capital, hasn't made our savings more secure. What it's done is it's made a lot of people extremely rich. So how do you solve that? Well, one is transactions taxes, financial transactions taxes. That may sound strange to people, it shouldn't. We've had financial transactions taxes in the United States. We still have them, in fact. The Securities and Exchange Commission is financed by a very, very small tax. I think it's 0.8%. They get about $3 billion a year from that, because you know, idea of the amount of trading. Okay, so that's 0.1% of the budget, roughly. That's just an 0.008% tax. We used to have a tax of 0.04% on stock trades. I would favor bringing back a tax. In the European Union, it looks like they'll implement a 0.1 percentage point tax on stock trades, probably sometime next year, 2017. And you know, that would go a long way towards reducing the amount of rents in the financial sector. So my calculations, you could probably raise in the order of 70, 80 billion a year with a very modest tax. And the point I should make about the tax, because I always get people go, oh, you know, my 401k or my mother, my grandparents are going to be paying this tax. You go, well, actually not, because one of the things that will happen when we put on this tax is people will do less trading. Okay, you know, if you have a 401k, odds are you aren't trading, but you have someone trading for you, they will do less trading. Basically, most of the cost of the tax will be made up for in less transactions, which to my view is a win-win. Government gets money, less money going to Wall Street, it's exactly what you want. You have a more efficient financial sector. Okay, so that's part of the story. Breaking up the large banks, a lot of research showing that large banks are able to borrow at lower than market interest rates because everyone assumes if they get in trouble, the government will bail them out. And of course, that's exactly what happened back in 2008, 2009, 2010. The government bailed out Bank of America, it bailed out Citigroup, it bailed out Goldman Sachs. So you'd have reason to believe that's going to happen. Okay, well, the answer to that is don't have banks that are too big to fail. Okay, break up the large banks. Okay, because when you have banks in that situation, basically they're borrowing at lower than market costs, courtesy of taxpayers. You know, so if we want to give someone a subsidy, my first choice would be Goldman Sachs. Okay, the last point, there's a lot of things the government does, and they hate to say this on Wall Street, but it's true. A lot of things the government does much more efficiently than the private sector. I'm mentioning Social Security because there's a lot of research on this, and we have some real comparisons. So the administrative costs of Social Security are about 0.5%, less than 0.5% of what gets paid out each year in benefits. A lot of people want to privatize Social Security. President Bush, the second President Bush wanted to privatize Social Security. A lot of the Republican candidates for president want to privatize Social Security. So this is still something being debated. We could look at examples. Chile is often held up as an example. They privatized their system back in 1981, 82, the early 80s. Okay, so it's an old established system. Their administrative costs are about 15% of what gets paid out each year. Our administrative costs are 0.5%. Theirs are 15%. UK, you know, if you want a country we think is more similar, England, they've had privatized systems. Their administrative costs are 10 to 15% of what gets paid out each year. So we're talking about administrative costs that are 20 or 30 times as much as with our public system. Now I've debated a lot of privatizers, and invariably they go, oh, we have this old-fashioned one-size-fits-all system. And my response is always, yeah. That's the whole point. Social Security is supposed to be a simple system. It's your core retirement income. We don't want people playing games with it. If you have extra money, by all means, you have the right, good thing. You know, you want to put money in the stock market, good thing, go ahead and do it. This is the money that's supposed to be there. We want that to be simple. Okay, and being simple makes it cheap. Okay, so there's other things you could talk about like that. There have been proposals put on the table. Senator Warren, I think Senator Sanders also has proposes having a postal banking system. You have that in other countries. You used to have that in the United States. A lot of people get gouged. A lot of low, moderate income people get gouged by the banks, you know, for having simple checking accounts, small loans. If you could have that done through the postal system, as was done, as is done in other countries, almost certainly you could do it at a much lower cost. I'll mention healthcare. It sounds really radical, but you know, we do have examples here. A country called Canada, many of you might have heard of, closer to me than to you. But in any case, Canada has a universal Medicare system. Okay, the administrative cost of their universal Medicare system, 2 to 3% of what gets paid out in benefits. The administrative cost of our private insurance system, 15 to 20% of what gets paid out in benefits. Okay, that's a lot of money. Okay, when you're talking about somewhere around $1 trillion a year in benefits being paid out. Okay, so there's a lot of cases you could point to where the government can provide services more efficiently than the private sector. And that, I think, is a very good thing to do. A, we save money. B, we downsize the financial industry. Again, win-win. Okay, trade and inequality. Again, we just had the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal come out. This is going to be in the news. I don't have any inside story on when exactly that's going to be put up for a vote. Clearly, somewhere in the not-too-distant future. Much of our trade policy has been about making it easy for companies to relocate their operations to Mexico, to China, wherever it might be. And that's not really a secret. If you look at NAFTA, there's extensive, there's a whole chapter on investment. It was about making it easy for General Electric or General Motors, whoever it might be, to set up a plant in Mexico, know that they don't have to worry about the Mexican government confiscating their factory, preventing them from repatriating their profits. That was what much of NAFTA was about. It was about making it easy for GM, GE, other manufacturing companies to relocate to Mexico. What do we expect to happen? Well, again, this is economic theory, so this isn't a question, oh, it didn't follow the plan. Again, I heard a lot of people say, well, things didn't turn out as was planned. No, that was the plan. That was the plan. That was the point. That was to make it easy. And there's an economic argument for that. I can make that for you. I won't go through it. But, there's an economic argument for that, and, it leads to benefits for the economy as a whole. But those tend to go to the people that own the factory, tends to go to higher paid workers. It doesn't go to manufacturing workers. They're the losers. Okay, that's all part of the story. Okay. Now, we could have done the opposite. We could have said, okay, let's look at high-wage workers. Let's look at doctors, lawyers, other professionals. There are a lot of people in Mexico, in India, and other developing countries, very smart people. They could train to be doctors and lawyers in the United States. We could train them to our standards. I always say this to people, oh, you want an Indian doctor? Well, some Indian doctors are very good, but I'm sure many of them are not trained to our standards. We could have them trained to our standards, and they would be glad to come to the United States and work for half the wages of our doctors. Okay? Our doctors get twice as much on average as doctors in Europe and Canada. That comes out of our pockets. Okay? It's not manna from heaven. We're paid for it in our healthcare costs. Okay, well, if we said, oh, here's a great way to reduce our healthcare costs, why don't we make it as easy as possible for smart people in India, China, other developing countries, study to our standards. If English isn't their native language, they're going to learn English, or Spanish, whichever. So they're going to come here, be able to communicate with their patients, learn, what we expect them to learn, and practice just as though they grew up in Houston and, went to med school here. That's free trade. I always say that to people, invariably they think I'm joking. Okay, and I go, well, that's because you're a protectionist. Free trade did not have to take the form it did. Globalization did not have to take the form it did. It went the way it did because the people making policy have brothers and sisters and daughters and sons and parents who are doctors and lawyers. They aren't auto workers. Okay, that's why it went the way it did. Okay, so it wasn't some natural tide. You can't hold back globalization. They did hold back globalization. They held it back to protect their friends. They didn't hold it back they in fact did the opposite. They wanted it to sink our manufacturing workers, to sink working class people in the United States. Conscious policy. Okay, corporate governance system. The United States, I'd say we've had a big change in our corporate governance system over the last 3 to 4 decades, and we've really diverged from the rest of the world in this respect. So if you look at, CEOs, I understand if we had our CEO of General Electric or some major company here, they'd say, oh, I've got all this responsibility, I get up early in the morning, I work late at night, I'm sure that's largely true, in most cases. It's a demanding job, work hard to get to the top, all that I'm sure is true. But of course, a lot of people have demanding jobs and work real hard and don't get paid $20 million a year. So that doesn't necessarily separate them from a lot of other people. Okay, but what we can say about CEO pay is that it's increased hugely over the last 3 to 4 decades relative to the pay of ordinary workers. So if you go back to the 60s and 70s, the pay of a CEO was typically 20, maybe 30 times that of an ordinary worker. So putting in today's dollars, if we say your medium worker, year-round worker, full-time is getting around 50, 60,000. A CEO back, in 1960s, 70s, it had gotten 20 to 30 times that, so we're talking about something like 1.2 to 1.8 million. Instead, they're getting 15, 20 million, 30 million, even paychecks over 100 million aren't unheard of. So we see a huge expansion of CEO pay. And I'd argue the reason for that is that the corporate boards are largely controlled by the CEOs themselves. So very often the corporate boards are appointed either directly or indirectly by CEOs, by top management. And basically, they see their obligations. The way they stay on the board is by staying in the good graces of top management. So typically, the directors go to 6, 8, maybe 10 meetings. I suppose some have as many as 12 meetings a year. They get paid, themselves six-figure salaries. So it's pretty good for moonlighting. You might get $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 for showing up at 6 or 8 meetings a year. And I suppose some of them don't show up for all the meetings, but in any case, those are your responsibilities. And you're able to keep doing that as long as you go along with everyone. So, when your CEO goes, hey, I got paid $12 million a year, CEO at the other company's getting 14, I should get 15 because I'm better than he or she is. Well, why would you argue? It's not your money. It belongs to the shareholders. What the hell do you care? It's very hard for the shareholders to go, wait, we got an overpaid CEO. They can, but it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult to organize shareholders. Just as, if we all decided, hey, we have real bad government, the billionaires are dominating it, we want to do something about it. We do want to do something about that, presumably, and we might try to organize, but we all know it's very, very difficult. Well, it's probably even worse with trying to, reverse the insider role in corporate governance, because they literally have $1 when you vote. Okay, we often talk about, I'm sure everyone's heard that term, that, if you're a billionaire, you give a lot of money to candidates you like, and that matters much more than one of us gives $100 or something. So we might talk about that, they have disproportionate say. Well, when you talk about, a company, a General Electric or whatever it might be, if you have 1 million shares, you have as million times as many votes as someone who has 1 share. Okay, so it literally isn't $1, 1 vote. It's very, very difficult to organize as a shareholder and say, hey, our CEO is getting paid too much money. Much easier if you're really unhappy about selling the stock. Okay, and that's mostly what happens. Okay, so you have this situation where you have CEOs get outlandish pay, and I would argue that matters not just for the CEOs, but that spreads through other sectors of the economy. I don't know what the top people here at the university get, at the college get, but you have a lot of college presidents that get 7-figure salaries because they go, hey, I'm running this big college, this big university. If I were running a business this size, I'd be getting 5 times as much, and that's probably true. Okay, so you have a lot of people, university presidents, and it spreads down through the university administration. They get very high 6-figure salaries, and that's because they're looking at the CEOs. You have, hospital administrators, presidents, they get that sort of pay. Even charities, if you look at United Way, other big charities, they're going to get 7-figure salaries. So this affects the economy in a big way because you have a lot of people in these positions getting very high pay, and again, that all comes from somewhere. Okay, solutions. How can you try to do something on this? One, just the most basic level, try and hold directors accountable. We have a thing on our website, Director Watch, where we try to highlight, who are the directors, because a lot of them are prominent people. Often they have, like academics. I know the head of the Rockefeller Foundation was on the board of Citigroup when they had to dump their CEO. But what were you doing? You're getting paid $200,000 a year. What were you doing? The shareholders basically forced them to dump them. Not something easily done. So one is try to hold these people accountable. The other is if you change the rules of governance so they actually had an incentive, the directors actually had an incentive to vote against these very high pay packages. Some of you may have heard Severance Pay. Has anyone heard of the idea of Severance Pay? Anyone's heard of that? Okay, this is something that was included in the Dodd-Frank financial reform bill, that every company has to put its executive compensation package up to a non-binding vote of its shareholders. I think it's every 3 years. I forget the exact interval. So that gives the shareholders an opportunity to say, they think this is too much. Now, again, it's very hard to organize and get them to say they think it's too much. It's very hard to do that. Less than 3% of the cases it's done. And it's kind of, a kick in the rear to the directors that, you gave our CEO so much money that we actually organized to say that was too much. Very, very rarely done. But even then, it's non-binding. It's just a kick in the rear. It doesn't do anything. Well, you could actually have a sanction. What I propose always gets people upset. I said, suppose you say that if you lose a say on pay package, you give up your stipend. Okay, so you're a director and you're counting getting $200,000 a year from your Citigroup stipend, and it turns out your say on pay package is voted down. It's happened. Well, you just lost your $200,000. Okay, that would give you a serious reason to think about how much are you paying the CEO. I don't know if that's the best thing to do, but we need some sort of check on the other side. Because as it stands now, it's not a market. Okay, it's, I always joke about that. If I were the CEO of ExxonMobil and I had all my friends as directors and they're sitting on, ExxonMobil's profits probably on the order of $40 billion a year, I'd say, hey, why don't you people give me a lot of money? You're my friends. And I hope they would, right? They're my friends. And that's basically the story you have, and that's not a good story. Okay, next story, the uses of patents and copyrights. So again, just to back up from what I have on the slide here, I understand, I don't know how many people I start talking about this and they act like, oh, well, if we didn't have patents, no one would innovate. Understand, patent monopoly is a way to give incentives for people to innovate. Okay, so copyright's obviously the same thing for artistic, creative work. So we give Taylor Swift copyrights, so she makes lots of money on her music or whatever. So we're giving people an incentive. That this is a government policy, though. Again, this is a prize in effect. So what we say is, you innovate, you develop, a new computer technology, new software, new drug. You get a monopoly on it for 20 years. You can sell it for lots of money. After that, it's in the competitive market. Okay, so that's one way to support research. Okay, so I'll come back to that in a minute. But that's, I understand it. Now, the question is, how much are we paying for that? And I focus on drugs because I think drugs, it's an important sector, both because it is very, very large relative to the economy. I raise economists, a lot of them are looking at me like, oh, it's not that big a deal. It is a big deal. It's a big deal in the economy. The other reason, of course, it's our health. So we're taking drugs. It's not just the money. I mean, this is, people take drugs they need to for their health, for their life, and it's important that they be good, that they have access to them, that they're good drugs, they're safe drugs. Okay, well, just give you the scales. We spent about $380 billion. Actually, this year we're going to spend over $400 billion. That's the number from last year. So it's about 2.2% of the economy goes directly to paying for prescription drugs. Now, what's striking, and you could document this because people always look at me like that's nuts. We'd spend around 10%, maybe even less than that, if we didn't have patents. So what that means is if all these drugs were available in a free market. So we could buy drugs just like I could buy this folder. There might be some patents in the folder, but they don't affect the price of the big. Okay, so it just sold like everything else in the economy. These drugs would be cheap. Okay, and I emphasize that for two reasons. One is, yes, it's a huge amount of money involved, but the other thing is you think of the ordeals that so many people have to put up with. Even people have insurance, so you have a drug, some of the new cancer drugs cost over $100,000 a year. Your insurance company does not want to pay that. Okay, now maybe you're lucky, you have good insurance, you're able to get them to pay it. Someone who's facing, cancer that could be fatal shouldn't have to be fighting with their insurance company. And almost invariably, if we snapped our fingers, got rid of that patent, that drug would sell for a few $100. Okay, so it's a really, really big deal. Okay, the other part of that story is that when I mentioned Severance, let me mention the specific case of Severance. Are people familiar with Severance? Hepatitis C drug? Okay, it's apparently a very effective drug for treating hepatitis C. It's a horrible, debilitating disease. It can be fatal. Okay, and we have treatments for it, but nothing that was a cure. Severance is apparently a cure, at least in most cases. I don't know if it's effective in every case, but it's effective in most cases. Okay, they're selling it for $84,000 per prescription. Now, there's been a lot of hand-wringing, certainly in my favorite paper, the Washington Post, they've had any number of columns going, well, are we going to pay for this for everyone? Because a lot of people who get the drug are on Medicare and Medicaid. They point out, some of the people probably got hepatitis C because they were alcoholics, they were drug users, and that's how they contracted it, and, do we really, Well, let's ignore the moral issue for a second. If we didn't have a patent on Severance, it would sell for about $300. And I didn't pull the number out of the air because generic Severance in India is selling for $300. Okay, and a company's making money on it too. It's not a charity. They're actually, they're making money. Someone makes money on this, selling this folder. Someone's making money. They obviously don't make huge money, but they make money. They're doing it as a profit-making business. If it were $300 a dosage, no one would be wringing their hands about, someone might have been a drug user. Should they really, come on, it's someone's life. It'll be very simple. Okay, we create an absurd problem for ourselves by having a patent monopoly that allows these outrageous drug prices. Okay, the other part of this, that when you give someone a patent monopoly, and again, here I want to strangle my economist friends. If I said, hey, we have a tariff on this jacket, so I'm going to pay 20% more because we have a tariff. Every economist in the country knows why that's stupid. You have inefficiencies in the market. They're going to have incentive to lobby Congress to make it 25%. They extend it to suit pants. So they go, that is really stupid policy. Okay, well, in the case of drug patents, we aren't talking about 20%. We're talking about like 1,000%, maybe 10,000%. The the case of Savati, we're increasing the price of the drug more than 100-fold. Okay, that's the same as a 10,000% tariff. And as I like to point out, markets aren't smart enough to distinguish between raising a price because of a tariff and raising a price because of a patent monopoly. Okay, so economists might like the patent monopoly and hate the tariff, but the market doesn't care. So you get the same sort of distortions and the same sort of incentives for people to do bad things. Okay, drug companies mislead the public about the safety and effectiveness of their drugs. Why? Because they sell them for 100 times the cost of production. Okay, if they were selling their drugs, the way those folders sold, you wouldn't have much incentive to really go out and lie about it. I mean, obviously you want to sell more, but you're not going to risk people's health, risk an indictment if you get caught. You wouldn't be making up all these lies. It happens all the time, though. You won't see a month go by where there's not an article in the New York Times where they talk about a major drug company having concealed evidence that its drug was harmful or not as effective as they claimed. Okay, and that's what happens when you allow drug companies to sell drugs for prices that are 100 times their cost. Okay, the last point is about the patent system. You encourage secrecy. I'm Pfizer. I'm doing research on my new drug. Okay, well, I have to put, some things in the public domain through the patent system. That's, so you read a patent, it's often very obtuse. I couldn't understand most of these patents. But in any case, there'll be 100, 200, some are 1,000 pages, scientific language that's available. Other scientists could use that. But I'm only going to put there what I actually need. Okay, so if I have other findings that might be useful, I'm not going to make those public. I'm going to use them myself. Last thing on earth is I want to do is put it in the public domain so that Merck or other competitors can go out there and take advantage of it. I'm not going to do that. Okay, so you encourage secrecy. Also, in terms of the test results, the clinical testing, again, you encourage secrecy in that we don't find out who did well, who did poorly with these drugs. Okay, so what are the solutions? Again, I understand you have to support this research. Patent monopolies are one way to do it. Okay, alternative is instead of having government grant the patent monopoly, why not just support it directly? Okay, we already do that to some extent in the case of prescription drugs. We spend over $30 billion a year through the National Institutes of Health. Most of that is more basic research. And by the way, I should point out everyone, including the pharmaceutical industry, says this is money very well spent. So if you want to say, oh, the government's stupid bureaucrats that can't do anything, the pharmaceutical industry will argue because they want us to spend $30 billion. They want us to spend more than that because it's a subsidy. But in any case, everyone agrees that this is money very, very well spent. Well, they could do more. Instead of just doing basic research, they could actually develop drugs, bring them through the process, the Food and Drug Administration's approval process, and actually put them on the market. And then they would be available as generics. Part of that story that I think would be very, very good is if you couldn't do that all at once, which I know you can never do all at once. If you just had the clinical trials, this is, basically, you could think of drug research being divided into two parts. One is the preclinical, where you have lab work, you're maybe working with animals, you're working with the chemicals. Preclinical. Then you have clinical, where you're actually testing this on people, making sure it's safe, making sure it's effective. The second part tends to be the more expensive part. If that were paid for by the government, you would have an enormous advantage that all that could be public. So what that would mean is that, if we're testing a new cancer drug, we have 2,000 people in our sample, 1,000 are the control group, 1,000 are the treatment group. We could immediately have up on the web for all the researchers, for doctors to see, okay, well, of the 1,000 that are in treatment group, 400 are women, 600 are men. We know what their ages are. We know if they suffer from other conditions. And then you can see who does better. Okay, so that would mean both other researchers could benefit from it, but also doctors, that they have a patient sitting in front of them. They're in their 50s, they're a woman, they have arthritis. Is this drug better? Is that drug better? You have all those results. We don't have that today. Okay, so without getting into a lot of details there, I just make the point. There are other ways that we can finance the research, ways that almost certainly would be more efficient and lead to less inequality than the patent system. Okay, labor management relations. Again, I would argue that the decline in unions has been to a large extent, perhaps not completely, but to a large extent, a function of policy. And just the basic numbers. If you go back to 1980, the unionization rate in the United States was about 20%. Private sector unionization rate was around 20%. Today it's around 7%. So you have a very, very rapid decline in unionization. And one of the reasons why I feel comfortable saying that that was policy and not just, people don't like unions anymore. Maybe they don't, but, they like the name less today than was true in 1980. If we look at Canada, which I'll stop picking Canada after this, But if we look at Canada, which is a pretty similar country, linguistically, economically, culturally, a pretty similar country, there's nothing like that in terms of decline in unionization rates. So the unionization rate, they had somewhat higher unionization than the US back in 1980, it was about 37%. And today, I don't know the exact number, 33, 34%. Okay, so there's been no dramatic decline in unionization rates in Canada, nothing at all like what we've had in the United States. Okay, which is why it leads me to believe that it's not just something that happened, it wasn't just the economy, it just wasn't changing people's tastes. So I mentioned some of the things that have led to this decline, or helped lead to this decline. One is certainly management practices. Management has undoubtedly become more aggressive in dealing with unions. There's a whole industry of union, I can't think of the right term for it, people who prevent you from getting unions, management consultants to keep you from getting unions. And it's become standard practice to fire a worker who's organizing the union drive. It's a lot of management consultants say, hey, you can find out who's organizing and fire them. It's against the law. Okay, so what happens? You fire someone because they're organizing? Well, if they could prove it, you never say, hey, I'm firing you because you're organizing a union. You say, I fire you because you came late Wednesday. Now, maybe 20 people came late Wednesday, but whatever. You did come late Wednesday. That's why I said it's the reason you got fired. Okay, so you have to go to National Labor Relations Board and prove that you got fired because you were organizing a union and not because you came late Wednesday. Okay, well, you can't just show up at the National Labor Relations Board next week. And if you go back to the Reagan era, they had an enormous delay. At one point, their backlog was in the order of 2 years. Okay, so think about that. Here you have a factory or a big store, whatever it is. You fire, you figure out, I got 5 people who are troublemakers. I'm going to fire them. And let's say they're all able to make their case. They don't get to have it heard for 2 years. Okay, then they finally have it heard. Okay, and they convince the person in the National Labor Relations Board that they're right. They were fired because they were organizing a union. So what do they get? Okay, well, they get their jobs back. Okay, and they're entitled to back pay, but not just the pay they lost. What they get is the difference between what they would have earned working for me and whatever alternative employment they had. Most people can't go 2 years without working. So, say I'm Walmart, fire someone, they have to find another job, they might even end up earning more. Okay, so what do I owe them? 0. Okay, so I go, hey, I fired these 5 people, maybe at the end of 2 years I'll owe them a little something, but I took the union away. Because everyone else saw, oh, I'm not going to mess with the union, you get fired. And saying, oh, I can go to National Labor, that'll do you a lot of good. So 2 years from now, they'll give you your job back. All right, so companies started doing that in a very big way beginning in the 80s. Not to say that, companies were happy to be unionized in the 50s and 60s, but that became very much a standard practice. Another common practice, strikes, that they began to fire strikers. And here kind of the big turning point was the air traffic controllers. The air traffic controllers went out on strike in 1981, and it was against the law, or let's just say arguably against the law. I'm not a lawyer, but I think it probably was against the law. Public sector workers aren't supposed to strike. We've had other strikes by public sector workers in the past at the federal level. The letter carriers went on strike in the early 70s. They worked out a deal, no one got fired. Many state and local employees, they often have struck, arguably violating the law. Usually it was papered over. I'm not saying no one ever got fired for it, but usually it was papered over. They worked out a deal and everyone came back to work. Reagan goes, you got 48 hours. If you're not back to work, you're all fired. Okay, well, they didn't come back to work. They were all fired. And then he brought in the military air traffic controllers to work as replacements. That changed the culture around firing striking workers. Prior to that, it was the general practice, if the UAW went out on strike against GM might operate with a skeletal crew with some management personnel. But basically the idea was their factories were shut down, the workers were on strike. The question was, could they go without producing longer than the workers could go without a paycheck? That was the deal. Okay. Suddenly you changed it. You said, you go on strike, we're bringing in replacement workers, you lost your job. Okay, and you have many major companies do that. Eastern Airlines, which no longer exists, but they did it. Greyhound Bus did it. There are a number of major companies that did that. That totally changed the dynamics of striking. Because it meant that it wasn't just going without a paycheck for a week, 2 weeks, a month, whatever it might be. It might be your job. Okay, and that made the strike a much, much less effective weapon. Okay, so again, you could argue whether you want to call that policy or not. They could have always done this. They could have fired striking workers in the 60s and 70s. It just wasn't done. The last point here, and this gets to the difference between the United States and basically every other Western country, that there's no severance pay in the United States, in the sense that, at least in law, in every other country, there's some amount of severance pay. So if you have a worker that has been working for your company for 5 years or 10 years, and you decide, okay, I don't need them anymore. In France and Germany, even in UK, they're entitled to some amount of severance pay. In the United States, you're out the door. Okay? There's basically no restrictions on that. That matters hugely in terms of providing more security to workers. It also matters from the standpoint of union organizing, that you have a lot more security. That if it were the case that your boss fired you because you're organizing a union, well, if you could at least get some severance pay, they would be less likely to do that. Okay, so that's the difference between the United States and pretty much every other Western country. Okay, last point on my list, full employment. This is something that does get attention, not nearly as much as I think it should. The issue here is that when the economy has a higher unemployment rate than need be, so what I'll say here is that there's some floor to what we can get the unemployment rate. I'll come to that in a second. The people who are unemployed are disproportionately those at the middle and bottom of the ladder. And just some basic numbers, if you look at the ratio of the African American unemployment rate to the white unemployment rate, it's pretty close to 2 to 1. I've always said that was a rule of thumb, and somebody asked me about it, and give me the data, and I looked, it was almost exactly 2 to 1, so it's really quite striking. Okay, so the point here is when we lower the unemployment rate, disproportionately we'll see African Americans getting jobs. Hispanics as well. It's not 2 to 1, it's about 1.5 to 1. Actually, it's getting a little lower thing. But in any case, so disproportionately, the most disadvantaged are the ones that get the job. African American teens, by the way, it's about 6 to 1. So what that means is if we lower the white unemployment rate by percentage point, we'll lower the unemployment rate for African Americans 2 percentage points, African American teens 6 percentage points. That's a really, really big deal. It also makes a big difference in terms of earnings power, because it's a fairly straightforward story. In a tight labor market, these people will have more earnings power than if you have a high unemployment rate. So basic story is that imagine you're working in a fast food restaurant, you're a retail clerk, something we think of as a not particularly high paying job. Well, you'll take what you get. You get the minimum wage, you'll take that because you don't have anywhere else to go. If suddenly it's a tight labor market, well, you tell your boss, well, I can get hired somewhere else for $1, $2, $3 more an hour. If I don't get that here, I'm out the door. Okay? And they'll do that if they know you'll be out the door. Okay, and that's not just speculation. We had this great experiment in the late 90s. Because if you go back to the 90s, the conventional wisdom, I like to talk about this because economists hate to talk about it. Conventional wisdom in the economics profession was the unemployment rate could not get below 6% without inflation starting to spiral upwards. And this is almost universally believed, across the political spectrum. So even a lot of liberal economists, all the economists in the Clinton administration believe this. So, the argument was that if the unemployment rate started to get below 6%, the Federal Reserve Board had to raise interest rates, deliberately slowing the economy and keeping people from getting jobs. And, it wasn't that they're evil people. The argument was, well, if we don't do that, inflation will go to 3%, go to 4%, and pretty soon, going to be double-digit inflation, and no one wants that. Okay? Straightforward argument, makes sense if you believe it follows like that. And again, they all felt that that level was 6%. Some of this might have said 5.8, 5.7, 5.6, but basically some of them said 6.4, 6.5, 6.6. So the center is pretty much 6%. Well, through a remarkable quirk, I trash Alan Greenspan on a lot of things, but the one thing I do give him credit for wasn't an orthodox economist. The unemployment rate came below 6%, and he did originally raise interest rates to slow the economy. He did that in 94. By 95, he took a look at the economy, saw the economy was slowing, didn't see any inflation. He said, well, let's lower interest rates. He had to argue with the Clinton appointees, including Janet Yellen, of course, is now Fed chair, and then she was the governor of the Fed. He had to argue with them because they said, you're going to get inflation. He said, I don't see any inflation. Why should I let the economy keep growing? Why should I let people get jobs? And he proved to be right. So the unemployment rate fell to 5% in 1996. It fell below 4.5 in 1998. And in 2000, as a year-round average, it was 4%. And the great story here was that you actually saw large increases in wages up and down the income ladder. So this is the only time since the early 70s that you saw consistent wage gains for people, say, at the 10th decile, 10th percentile of the income distribution, the 20th, 30th, 40th percentile of the income distribution, they actually had larger wage gains than those at the 90th percentile. Okay, so I think there's a very clear story here. We get low rates of unemployment. You will see wage gains for those at the middle and bottom. And you know, there are a lot of great stories. I go back, you know, I like to read them because it's good to see. You know, in the business press, you had restaurants that were complaining, we can't get workers. McDonald's in some places offering $300 bonuses for someone to bring in a friend as a worker. You know, there were stories of, you know, suburban restaurants, hotels that were arranging to have buses pick people up in the inner cities to drive out to work in their, you know, their restaurants and hotels because they couldn't get people to do it. You know, ordinarily they couldn't care less about the people in the inner city. But now they're going, hey, we need these people. Okay, so they would arrange for transportation, because obviously transportation tends not to be very good if you don't have a car to drive out to the suburb. Okay, so we saw a lot of things going the right way. All right, so I would argue if, again, we got to very low unemployment, if we got to something like 4% unemployment again, we would see a similar story today. And I mentioned that, you know, it's particularly important in the context of where we are now, because the Federal Reserve Board, you know, anyone who's been following this closely, everyone expects them to raise interest rates in December. And the whole point of raising interest rates is to slow the economy, to slow the rate of job creation, keep the unemployment rate from falling further. Okay, I would argue we do not want to see that. We want to see the unemployment rate keep falling, and the risk of inflation, you know, at least to my view, is very remote, and, you know, to my view, a very, very small price to pay to allow a lot more people to get jobs. Okay, so the last point that I have here, central banks should be accommodated, not fixated. I have no idea. When I wrote my book, I wrote a book recently on the benefits of full employment, and one of the things I did in writing the book was I wanted to review the literature, and I followed this back in the 90s when central banks were adopting 2% inflation targets. I wanted to see, like, why would you do that? Why was that a good thing to do? And I thought there'd be like these great papers that showed this is a really important thing to do. I looked at it, it was pretty damn weak. There's not really a good story. So, you know, I like numbers as much as anyone else, but, you know, 2% inflation really doesn't do much for me. But in any case, we have a long way to go just to have the inflation rate rise to 2%, and if we were to cross it a little bit, that's actually, to my view, not a big problem. Again, not arguing that we want 5%, 10% inflation, but if we have 2.5% or 3% inflation, I just don't see that as being a real big problem. If that's a price you pay for having the unemployment rate fall by, you know, 1 or 2 percentage points, and having moves more people have jobs and see wage gains at the middle and the bottom of the income distribution, that's a really big deal. The last point I'll just make about that, again, this is a policy decision. Okay, so if the Federal Reserve Board raises rates and keeps the unemployment rate from falling, as a policy decision, they've decided they don't want a lot of people to have jobs. They've decided they don't want a lot of people to have wage gains. They have a reason for it, could be right, but that's a policy decision. That isn't something that just happens. But one last point I'll make on this, again, that wasn't clear. This is a change in the sense that if we look back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, the unemployment rate was averaged considerably lower than the period since 1980s. So there's a much greater emphasis on inflation, combating inflation with high unemployment. And again, I think this goes back to sort of explaining the story of why it was in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, there tended to be broadly shared prosperity, whereas in the 80s, 90s, and the last decade, basically the gains went overwhelmingly to those at the top. A lot of that was simply the Fed's policy of having higher unemployment in order to combat inflation. Okay, so just to sum up, inequality did not just happen. We have a set of policies, you know, many of whom, not all of them, I identify here. We have a set of policies that helped bring about inequality, and obviously the corollary is we can have different policies. Okay, and just to say, you know, one more word on that, you know, getting back to the point I was saying at the beginning, we can talk about having government policies of redistribution. I don't think they're a bad thing. You know, should we have a higher EIT, earned income tax credit? Good thing in my view. More generous Social Security? Good thing in my view. Okay, so there's a lot of things we do like that. We can do more of them. But to my view, the more important issue is to reverse the factors that led to the inequality in the first place. Okay, I think that's the better way to go, both for political reasons and also economic reasons. Okay, so I'll stop with that. Thank you.